Lyddie by Katherine Paterson. Chapter 7, South to Freedom. Lyddie set out at once, or nearly at once. First Tryphena made the girl put on her own second-best pair of boots. They were, of course, too large for Lyddie, so she had to wait while the cook fetched 2 extra pairs of stockings and paper with which to stuff the toes. When Lyddie objected, Tryphena kept muttering, "A person can't walk to Massachusetts barefoot. Not in April, she can't." Next, Tryphena made her wait until she packed her a parcel of food large enough to feed a table of harvesters, and finally she gave her a tiny cloth purse with 5 silver dollars in it. "It's too much," Lyddie protested. "I'm not having your dead body on my conscience," the cook said. "It'll be enough for coach fare and the stops along the way. The only tavern food I trust is my own. But the mistress—" "You leave the mistress to me. I'll pay you back the money, with interest, when I can," Lyddie promised. Tryphena only shook her head and gave her a pat on the buttocks as though she were 5 years old. "Just don't forget me, eh? Give your old friend a thought now and again. That's all the interest I'll be wanting." It was 3 in the afternoon before she could even start her journey, but she would not let Tryphena persuade her to wait. She might let the mistress talk her into staying or lose her nerve if she didn't set out at once. Her heart was light, even if her feet felt clumsy in their makeshift boots and oversized stockings. She remembered Ezekiel and thought, "He walked north for freedom, and I'm walking south." She had forgotten in the excitement that she had already walked above 10 miles that day, but her feet remembered. Long before dark they were chafing in the unaccustomed bindings of stockings and ill-fitting boots, reminding her that they had done too much. She sat down on a rock and took the boots off, but before long she felt chilled, so she put them on again and started out, but more slowly than before. Then, just at dusk, the sky opened and it began to rain. Not light spring showers, but cold, soaking torrents of rain, streaming down her face, ice-sickling rivulets down her chest and legs. She was obliged, reluctantly, to stop in the next village and seek shelter for the night. The mistress of the local inn was at first shocked to see a young girl traveling alone, and then solicitous. "You look near drowned," she cried, and asked her where she thought she was headed. "Lowell, is it? Well, the stagecoach will be coming through the end of the week. Work for me till then, and I'll give you your board." Lyddie hesitated, but her sodden clothes and blistered feet reminded her how unsuited she was to continue the journey. She gratefully accepted the mistress's offer and worked so hard that before the week was out the woman was begging her to forget Lowell and stay on. But Lyddie was not to be persuaded. She boarded the coach on Thursday in the same dismal rain she'd arrived in. Handing over 3 of her precious dollars to the driver, she settled herself in the corner of the carriage. There were only 2 other passengers, a man and a woman who seemed to be married, though they hardly spoke to each other. The woman gave Lyddie's dress and shawl and strange boots a critical going over with her eyes, then settled again to her knitting, which the bumping of the coach made difficult. With the muddy roads it took 2 days to get to Windsor. They had not even left Vermont. Lyddie often wished she had saved her dollars and walked, rain or no rain. Surely she could have made it just as fast, but at least the disagreeable people left the coach at Windsor. The bed in the inn was infested with bugs, so she felt both filthy and itchy the next morning, and was not happily surprised that the coach, which had seemed overcrowded with 3, was now to carry 6 as far as Lowell. One of the passengers was a girl about her own age. Lyddie wanted to ask her if she too was going for a factory girl, but she had a young man with her who appeared to be her brother, so Lyddie was hesitant to speak. Then, too, she remembered the look the previous female passenger had given her. The 6 of them were jammed into the carriage. There was hardly room for any of them to move, yet the rolling and pitching of the coach seemed worse rather than better for the load. Lyddie tried to sit delicately on one hip and then the other, to spread the bruising out, if possible. One of the gentlemen lit a large pipe, and the odor of it nearly made her retch. Fortunately, another gentleman reminded him sternly that there were ladies present, and the first man reluctantly tapped his pipe against the metal fixings of the door. But the stench had already been added to the air of foul breath and strong body odors. Lyddie longed for a healthy smell of a farmyard. People were so much fouler than critters. And still, when the others weren't concentrating on keeping their seats in the swaying coach, they were looking at her clothes especially. At first she was mortified, but the longer they rode, the angrier she became. How rude they were, these so-called gentry. Everyone's clothes were a disgrace before they'd reached Lowell. The thaw and spring rains had turned parts of the roadway into muddy sloughs, and despite the coachman's skill, early on the last morning they were stuck fast. The passengers were all obliged to alight, and the 4 men ordered by the coachman to push the wheels out of the rut. Lyddie watched the hapless gentleman heave and shove and sweat, all to no avail. The coachman yelled encouragement from above. The men grunted and cursed below as their fancy breeches and overcoats turned brown with the mud and their lovely beaver hats went rolling off down the road. After at least a quarter of an hour of watching, she could stand their stupidity no longer. Lyddie took off her worn shawl, tied it about her waist, and tucked up her skirts under it. She found a flat stone and put it under the mired wheel. Then she waded in, her narrow shoulders shoving two of the gaping men aside as she set her own strong right shoulder against the rear wheel, ordered the men to the rear boot, and called out, 1, 2, 3, heave! Above, she heard the laughter of the coachman. The men beside her were not smiling, but they did push together. The wheel rolled over the stone, and the coach was free to continue the journey. She was filthy, but she hardly cared. She could only think of how ignorant, how useless her fellow passengers had been. None of them thanked her, but she hardly noticed. She was eager to be going, but not to ride inside. She looked up at the still smiling coachman. "Can I come up?" she called. He nodded. Lyddie scrambled up beside him. None of the gentlemen offered her a hand, but she needed none, having spent her life climbing trees and ladders and roofs. The coachman was still chuckling as he gave the horses a crack of the whip. Cries of protest rose up from the passengers below. He jerked the reins, his eyes twinkling as more cries came up from the irate inmates as they tried to disentangle their bodies in the carriage and settle themselves on the seats once more. He shook his head at Lyddie and held the pawing team for a few moments until the jostling in the carriage finally ceased. "You're a hardy one, you are," he said, reaching into the box behind him to pull out a heavy robe. "Here, this'll keep the chill off." She wrapped the robe around her head and body. "Silly fool," she said. "Not the common sense of a quill pig mongst the lot of them. Why didn't you tell them what to do, eh?" "What?" he said. "And lose the entertainment?" Lyddie couldn't help but laugh, remembering the sight of those sweating, swearing, filthy gentlemen, and now they were further poisoning the already stale air of the carriage with their odor and road mud. Indeed, someone was already raising the shade to let in a bit of cold, fresh air. "So you're for the factory life?" Lyddie nodded. "I need the money." He glanced sideways at her. "Those young women dress like Boston ladies," he said. "I don't care for the fancy dress. There's debts on my farm." "And it's your farm now, is it?" "My father's," she said, "but he headed west 4 years ago, and we haven't heard." "You're a stout one," he said. "Ain't you brothers to help?" "One," she said, "and he'd be a great help, only my mother put him out to a miller's, so until— Have you someone to look out for you in Lowell, a relative, or a friend?" She shook her head. "I'll do all right on my own." "I've no doubt of that," he said, "but a friend to put in a word can't hurt. Let me take you to my sister's. She runs a boarding house, number 5 it is, of the Concord Manufacturing Corporation. I'm obliged for your kindness, but think of it as payment for your help. You could have had it out in no time, had you, but never such fun. Coaching can be a wearisome, lonesome job, my girl. I take my pleasure where I can. Did you see those gentlemen's faces having to be rescued by a slip of a farm girl?" They crossed the bridge into the city late that afternoon, and city it surely was. It seemed to Lyddie that there were as many buildings crowded before her as sheep in a shearing shed, but they were not soft and murmuring as sheep. They were huge and foreboding in the gray light of afternoon. She would not have believed that the world contained as much brick as there was in a single building here. They were giants, 5 and 6 stories high, and as long as the length of a large pasture. Chimneys, belching smoke, reached to the low-hanging sky. And the noise of it! Her impulse was to cover her ears, but she held her hands tightly in her lap. She would not begin to be afraid now, she who had stared down a bear and conversed easily with a runaway slave. The other passengers in their muddy clothing and with their various trunks alighted at the Merrimack Hotel. Lyddie could tell at a glance it was too grand for her purse and person. In the end, she waited until the coachman had seen the horses and carriage taken care of, and then let him walk her to his sister's boarding house. "I've brought you a little chip of Vermont granite," he explained to the plump, smiling woman who met them at the door. Then he added, "We'd best come in by the back. Run into a little muddy stretch on the way down." Chapter 8, Number 5, Concord Corporation. At first she thought it was the bear, clanging the oatmeal pot against the furniture, but then the tiny attic came alive with girls. One struck a stick against a box, making the flash and odor of a tiny hell, and all this was just to light a candle that barely softened the pre-dawn gloom of the attic. In the clatter of 5 girls dressing and squabbling over a single basin, Lyddie was forced fully awake and began to remember where she was. Filthy as she had been, Mrs. Bedloe, the coachman's sister, had kindly taken her in. The boarding-house keeper hurriedly gave her brother a cup of tea and sent him on his way. Then she had her son, a boy about Charlie's age, fill a tub of hot water in her own bedroom and ordered Lyddie to bathe. The mud-caked dress and shawl she carried away as soon as Lyddie shed them and plopped them directly in a pot of boiling water on the black iron cook stove. And what a stove it was! Lyddie had only heard rumors of such modern wonders. When she came in from the boarding-house keeper's bedroom, her face scrubbed barn red, her warm, lazy body straining every seam of her one remaining dress, the first thing her eyes lit upon was that stove. She stared at it as though it were an exotic monster from the depths of the sea. If she could have chosen, Lyddie would have pulled a chair close to it and felt its wonderful warmth and studied its marvels. But Miss Bedloe urged her into the dining room, which was soon filled with a noisy army of almost 30 young women, still full of energy after their long day in the factory. Lyddie's own head nearly settled into the plate of pork and beans, so that long before the others had finished, Miss Bedloe helped her up the 4 flights of stairs to the attic room, where she fell into bed, hardly awake enough to mumble thanks for the woman's kindness. And now, on this first morning of her new life, she lay in bed a few minutes to relish the quiet of the empty attic. 3 days rattling in a coach, then to share a room with 5 others. Indeed, a bed with a stranger who woke Lyddie in the middle of the night with her tossing and snoring, to be clanged awake by a bell, and to have her head punctured by shrieks and squeals and the rattle of voices. It made the windowless alcove she had left behind at Cutler's seem a haven of peace. But she would not look back. She threw off the quilt. She had nothing to wear but her much too small homespun. It couldn't be helped. She dressed herself and padded down the 4 flights of stairs in her darned and redarned stockings. The front room was crowded with the 2 large dining tables that Tim, Miss Bedloe's son, was scurrying to set. Wonderful smells of coffee and apple pie and hash and, would it be fish, wafted through the house from the magical stove as though to prove how many separate wonders it could perform at once. "I've left my boots," Lyddie started. Miss Bedloe looked up, her round face radiant from the heat. "They're by the stove drying, but they won't do, you know. Eh? Your clothes, your boots, they simply won't do. That dress is only fit now to be burned, or what's left of it. I'm afraid it turned to mud stew in my kettle. What could my crazy brother have been thinking of letting a mere girl—" "Oh, it wasn't his fault, ma'am," said Lyddie, slipping her feet into Tryphaena's boots, now stiff from a night beside the stove. "It was the men. They were so stupid. You needn't tell me. I know that brother of mine. He was sitting up on top laughing, not giving a word of direction. But he had the coach and team. Nonsense. He does it to amuse himself and humiliate his betters. He'd wreck a coach if he thought it would give him a rollicking story to tell in the tavern that night, and all at the cost of your clothes and dignity. Well, I ain't lost much either way. Have you any money at all?" Lyddie hesitated. She really didn't. It was Tryphaena's money, not her own. "If I'm to recommend you to the Concord Corporation, you need to look decent. They like to hire a good class of girls here." Lyddie reddened. "Of course, you're as good as anyone, a better worker than most, I suspect, but at the factory they'll look at your clothes and shoes to decide. The Almighty may look at the heart, but man looketh on the outward appearance, as the good book says, and that goes for women too, I fear. So you'll have to do better than—" She looked sadly at Lyddie's tight homespun and stiff worn boots. Lyddie hung her head. "I have a bit left over from the trip, but it's on loan. You can pay it back after you're working. Now, would you like to give me a hand? I think the girls will be home for breakfast early. The river's too high and the mill wheels are likely slowing. It means a holiday for them, but not for me." Lyddie hastened to grab a cloth and take a pie Miss Bedloe was removing from the bowels of the stove. "Yes," Miss Bedloe continued, "there'll be a few days off now till the water goes down," she smiled. "Time enough to get you proper clothes and a place in the factory as well. If the girls had seemed noisy before, it was nothing compared to their entrance to breakfast. They burst through the door, each high-pitched voice shrieking to be heard over the others. There was an air of holiday that hardly paused for a blessing over the food, and that erupted full blast before the echo of the Amen died. Lyddie, her feet alternately sloshing about and being pinched by Tryphaena's shoes, determinedly helped Tim serve both large tables. They brought in great platters of fried cod, hash, potato balls, pumpkin mush with high pitchers of cream, toast and butter, apple pie, and pitchers of coffee and milk. Lyddie had never seen harvesters eat so much or so noisily, and these were supposed to be ladies. "Hello there," a voice cut through the din. "We didn't really meet you." The room was suddenly quiet. "Don't be rude, Betsy," another said. "She was tired last night." Lyddie turned to see who had said this last, because it was her idea of a lady's voice. The young woman who had spoken was smiling. "You only came in last night, didn't you, my dear?" Lyddie nodded. "There, don't be shy. We were all new once, even our Betsy." There was a titter from the rest. I'm Amelia Kate. Her name was aristocratic, Amelia. It suited her. She was almost as pretty as the lady in pink that had come through the inn last year. Her skin was white and her face and hands long and delicate, and she was respected, or the others wouldn't have stopped chattering when she spoke. And you? Lyddie Worthen. Lydia Worthen. With a rough finger she scratched at the tight homespun against her chest. It seemed to Lyddie that the room was full of young women, all well-dressed, all delicate, all beautiful, and she a crow among peacocks. Vermont, isn't it? Said the one called Betsy, and a few of the others laughed. What's the matter with Vermont? The voice had a bare trace of a Green Mountain twang. I'm from near Rutland myself. Where do you hail from, Lyddie? Lyddie turned to see a girl not much older than herself, but like all the others, whiter of complexion. She had light hair braided in a crown about her head, and a serious face that a few freckles failed to relieve. Lyddie pulled at her own straggly brown plaits, grateful when attention shifted and the room was once again filled with chattering. After breakfast, Amelia and the Rutland girl, whose name was Prudence Allen, offered to take her shopping for a proper dress, work apron, shoes, and bonnet. As they were leaving, Mrs. Bedloe pressed something into Amelia's hand, which turned out to be $1 that Mrs. Bedloe claimed was a payment from her roguish brother for damages to Lyddie's clothing on the way. Much to Lyddie's distress, it took all the money she had left, including the coachman's $1, to dress her in a manner that satisfied Amelia and Prudence. She was so pained at the waste of money that she couldn't enjoy any of the new things, though she was pressed to wear the shoes home. In her heart she knew that she had never had a better fitting pair. Even the stiffness that she felt around the toes and heels and ankles was simply a reminder that she had on grand new city boots. When they were broken in, she would be able to walk anywhere in such shoes, even home. Lyddie never quite knew how it was decided, but Miss Bedloe told her that evening that she would move her things from the attic to Amelia and Prudence's room on the 3rd floor. The other girls might grumble, which indeed they did, being passed over for a choice room by a newcomer, but Amelia had persuaded Miss Bedloe that since Lyddie had no relatives or friends in the house, indeed in the city, she needed their particular caring. Miss Bedloe, still feeling guilty about her brother, gave in, so Lyddie was moved to a smaller bedroom on the 3rd floor to be with Amelia, Prudence, and the obviously disgruntled Betsy, who since their previous roommate had gone home to New Hampshire the week before, had had the luxury of a bed to herself. 4 to a room was in itself a luxury, as most of the rooms held 6, but even so, there was hardly any space to walk around the 2 double beds, the 2 tiny nightstands, and the various trunks and bandboxes of the inhabitants. There was no place to sit except on the beds, but then on a regular work day there was no leisure time except the less than 3 hours between supper and curfew. Most of the girls spent their short measure of free time down in the parlor, dining room, or out in town where there were shops and lectures and even dances, all run by honest citizens bent on parting the working girls from their wages. Now, said Amelia, who was far more conscientious about her duties as caretaker than Lyddie would have wished, where will you be going to church on the Sabbath? Lyddie looked up in alarm. Living as far as they had from the village, the Worthens had never even bothered to pay pew rent in the village Congregational church. I hadn't thought to go. Amelia sighed, reminding Lyddie that she was proving a harder case than the older girl had bargained for. Oh, but you must, she said. What Amelia means, Betsy said, looking up from her novel, is that regardless of the state of your immortal soul, the corporation requires regular attendance of all its girls. It makes us look respectable, even those of us who waste our precious minds on novels. Oh, do behave yourself, Betsy. Sorry, Amelia, but if I let you carry on about her moral duties when the girl plainly has no notion of them herself, this conversation will last all night. She put down her book and looked Lyddie straight in the face. They'll probably make you put in an appearance from time to time somewhere. The Methodists don't press girls for pew rent, so if you're short on money, best go there. You have to pay for it in longer sermons, but nonetheless, I always recommend the Methodists to new girls with no particular desire to go anywhere. Betsy! Betsy likes to sound shocking, Prudence explained patiently. Don't take it to heart. She was brushing out her long blonde hair and looked like a princess in a fairy tale, though her voice was far too matter-of-fact for a storybook. But, how should Lyddie explain it? But ain't Massachusetts a free country? Of course, my dear, Amelia said, but there are rules and regulations here, as in any civilized establishment. They are meant for our own good, my dear. You'll see. Betsy rolled her eyes and went back to her novel. The next morning, Miss Bedloe led Lyddie down the street past all the corporation boarding houses to the bridge that led to the factory complex. Between 2 low brick buildings was a tall wooden fence. The gate of the fence was locked like a jail yard, but Miss Bedloe wasn't deterred. She simply went to the door of one of the low buildings and walked in. Lyddie followed, dragging her feet, for the room they entered was larger than the main floor of Cutler's Tavern, and it was crowded with tables and scriveners' desks. There were a few men working about the huge room who looked up over their pens and account books as the two women passed, but it was clear that nothing much was being accomplished, even in the counting room, now that the water was too high to drive the mill wheel. Miss Bedloe walked straight through the room and out the door on the opposite side into a courtyard large enough, it seemed to Lyddie, for the whole of their mountain farm to fit inside. The front gate and low south buildings, the counting house, offices, and storerooms, as Miss Bedloe explained, formed part of the enclosure. The two slightly shorter sides were taller frame structures, the machine shops and repair shops, and across the whole north end of the compound was the cotton mill itself, a gigantic 6-story brick building. At one end ran the frame structure of the outdoor staircase. From the brick face, 6 even rows of windows seemed to glower down at her through the gray April drizzle like so many unfriendly eyes. A bell tower rose from the long roof, making the building seem even taller and more forbidding. It must seem imposing to a farm girl, Miss Bedloe said. Lyddie nodded and tightened her grip on her shawl to keep from trembling. Miss Bedloe turned back toward the low south building and knocked on a door marked Agent. "I've brought you a new girl," she said cheerily to the young man who opened the door, "fresh from the farm and very healthy, as you can see." The young man hardly gave Lyddie a glance, but stepped back and held the door for them to come in. "I'll see if Mr. Graves can spare a minute," he said haughtily. "These clerks do put on airs," Miss Bedloe whispered, but if she was trying to make Lyddie feel more at ease, she failed, nor was the sight of the agent himself any comfort. "Miss Bedloe, isn't it?" He was a fat, prosperous-looking man, but without the manners to stand when a middle-aged lady came into his office. Miss Bedloe talked very fast, her face flushed. Lyddie was sure the man would turn them both away. He looked barely patient as Miss Bedloe rattled on, but in the end he said he would give Lyddie a contract for 1 year. There was a shortage in the weaving room at the moment. Mr. Thurston, the clerk, would give the girl the broadside with the regulations for the Concord, and arrange for her to have her smallpox vaccination the following morning. They were dismissed with a nod. Miss Bedloe punched Lyddie and prompted her to thank the agent for his kindness. Lyddie's voice could hardly manage a whisper, but it didn't matter. The gentleman wasn't paying her any attention. She signed the paper where the clerk pointed, tried to listen carefully to all his warnings about what the contract demanded, and stuffed the broadside that he handed her into her apron pocket. She would study it tonight, she decided, her heart sinking. She could tell at a glance that it would be almost impossible for her to make out the meaning of such a paper. Oh, if only Charlie were here to read it aloud to her and explain the long words. Factory girls were not supposed to be ignorant, it would seem. It would be several months before she could read with ease the regulations for the boarding houses of the Concord Corporation. But she found out the next day that it concealed unpleasant truths. The first of these was the vaccination. Miss Bedloe marched her over to the hospital after dinner, where a doctor cruelly gouged her leg and poured a mysterious liquid directly into the wound. Lyddie was even more distressed when the wound turned into a nasty sore in a few days' time, but she was only laughed at for her distress and told it was all for her own good. She'd never get the pox now, so she should be grateful. Amelia, indeed, was always instructing her to be grateful about things that Lyddie, try as she might, could not summon the least whiff of gratitude over. But finally, when she had been alternately shocked and bored for the better part of 2 weeks, the announcement was made at supper that work was to begin again the next day, and Lyddie felt a surge of gratitude that her days of idleness were over. She would be a true factory girl in a few hours' time. Lyddie was mostly disappointed, but perhaps a tiny bit relieved when Miss Bedloe announced that she would take her over to the weaving room after dinner. The large noonday meal must be out of the way and the dishes washed before the housekeeper could spare a moment, she said. Besides, it wouldn't do to be totally worn out the first day. 4 hours would be plenty to start with. The gate was locked. "They don't want tardy girls slipping past," Miss Bedloe explained. "You must always take care to be here when the bell rings." They entered the factory complex through the counting room as they had 2 weeks before, but this time it was teeming with men, all dressed like gentlemen. Every head seemed to rise, and every eye looked their way. Despite her new clothes, Lyddie could feel the shame burning through her rough brown cheeks. She ducked her bonneted head and hurried through as fast as she could, almost shoving Miss Bedloe in her haste. Once in the yard, she was acutely aware of the thudding. The pulse of the factory boomed through the massive brick wall, and she could feel the vibrations of the machinery as they made their way up the shadowy wooden staircase, which clung for dear life to the side of the building. Miss Bedloe huffed ahead, stopping more than once to catch her breath on the climb to the 4th floor. Once there, she jerked open the door, and the thudding beat exploded into a roar. She gave Lyddie a little push toward the racket. "Mr. Marsden is expecting you," she yelled. "He'll see you settled in," and she was gone. Chapter 9. The Weaving Room. Creation, what a noise! Clatter and clack, great shuddering moans, groans, creaks, and rattles, the shrieks and whistles of huge leather belts on wheels. And when her brain cleared enough, Lyddie saw through the murky air row upon row of machines, eerily like the old hand loom in Quaker Stevenson's house, but as unlike as a nightmare, for these creatures had come to life. They seemed moved by eyes alone, the eyes of neat, vigilant young women, needing only the occasional swift intervention of a human hand to keep them clattering. From the overarching metal frame crowning each machine, wooden harnesses carrying hundreds of warp threads drawn from a massive beam at the back of each loom clanked up and down. Shuttles holding the weft thread hurtled themselves like beasts of prey through the tall forest of warp threads, and beaters slammed the threads tightly into place. With alarming speed, inches of finished cloth rolled up on the beams at the front of the looms. The girls didn't seem afraid or even amazed. As she walked by with the overseer, girls glanced up. A few smiled, some stared. No one seemed to mind the deafening din. How could they stand it? She had thought a single stagecoach struggling to hold back the horses on a downhill run was unbearably noisy. A single stagecoach! A factory was 100 stagecoaches all inside one skull, banging their wheels against the bone. Her impulse was to turn and run to the door, down the rickety stairs, through the yard and counting room, across the narrow bridge, past the row of boarding houses, down the street, out of this hellish city, and back to the green hills and quiet pastures. But of course she didn't move a step. She didn't even cover her ears against the assault. She just stood quietly in front of the machine that the overseer had led her to, and pretended she could hear what he was saying to her. His mouth was moving, a strange little red mouth peeping out from under his bushy black mustache. The luxuriant growth of the mustache was all the more peculiar because the overseer had hardly any hair on his head. His pate gleamed like polished wood. Suddenly, to Lyddie's astonishment, the man put his red mouth quite close to her ear. She jerked her head away before she realized he was shouting the words, "Is that quite clear?" Lyddie stared at him in terror. Nothing was clear at all. What did the man mean? Did he seriously think she could possibly have heard any of his mysterious mouthings? But how could she say she had heard nothing but the beastly racket of the looms? How could she say she could see hardly anything in the morning gloom of the huge barn-like room, the very air of soup of dust and lint? She was simply standing there, her mouth open with no words coming out, when an arm went around her shoulders. She shrank again from the touch before she saw it was one of the young women who tended the looms. Her head was close enough to Lyddie's left ear so that Lyddie could hear her say to the overseer, "Don't worry, Mr. Marsden. I'll see she settles in." The overseer nodded, obviously relieved not to have to deal with Lyddie or the loom he'd assigned her. "We'll work together," the girl shouted in her ear. "My 2 machines are just next to you here. I'm Diana." She motioned for Lyddie to stand close behind her right shoulder, so although Lyddie wasn't in her way as she worked, the older girl could speak into Lyddie's left ear by turning her head slightly to the right. Suddenly, Diana banged a metal lever at the right of the machine, and the loom shivered to a halt. At either end of the shed, made by the crisscrossing of warp threads, was a narrow wooden trough. From the trough on the left she retrieved the shuttle. The shuttle was wood, pointed, and tipped at either end with copper. It was about the shape of a corn cob, only a little larger and hollowed out so that it could carry a bobbin or quill of weft thread. With her hands moving so quickly that Lyddie could hardly follow them, Diana popped out a nearly empty quill of thread and thrust in a full one from a wooden box of bobbins near her feet. Then she put her mouth to a small hole near one end of the shuttle and sucked out the end of the weft thread. "We call it the kiss of death," she shouted, smiling wryly to soften the words. She pulled out a foot or more of the thread, wound it quickly around one of 2 iron hooks, and rehung the hooks into the last row of woven cloth. The hooks were attached by a yard or so of leather cord to a bell-shaped iron weight. You have to keep moving your temple hooks, Diana said. Pulls the web down snug as you go. She pointed to the new inches of woven fabric. Now, said Diana, speaking to Lyddie's ear, make sure the shuttle is all the way at the end of the race. Always on your right here. She placed the shuttle snug against the right-hand end of the trough. We don't want any flying shuttles. All right, then. We're ready to go again. Diana grasped the metal lever, pulled it toward the loom, and jammed it into a slot. The loom shuddered once more to life. For the first hour or so, Lyddie watched, trying mostly to stay out of Diana's way as she moved among the three machines, two opposite and one adjoining. The older girl refilled the shuttles when they ran low and rehung the temple hooks to keep the web tight. Then, without warning, for no reason that Lyddie could see, Diana slammed off one of the looms. See, she said, pointing at the shed. A warp thread's snapped. If we don't catch that, we're in trouble. An empty shuttle might damage a few inches of goods, she explained, but a broken warp could leave a flaw through yards of cloth. We don't get paid when we ruin a piece. She pinched a tiny bag hung from the metal frame of the loom. It spit out a puff of talc, which she rubbed into her fingertips. Then, fishing out the broken ends of warp, she showed Lyddie how to fasten them together with a weaver's knot. When Diana tied the ends, they seemed to melt together, leaving the knot invisible. She stepped aside. Now you start it, she said. Lyddie was a farm girl. She took pride in her strength, but it took all of her might to yank the metal lever into place. She broke into a sweat like some untried plow horse. The temples were not much larger than apples, but when Diana asked her to move one, she felt as though someone had tied a gigantic fieldstone to the end of the leather cord. Still, the physical strength the work required paled beside the dexterity needed to rethread a shuttle quickly, or heaven help her, tie one of those infernal weaver's knots. Everything happened too fast. A bobbin of weft thread lasted hardly 5 minutes before it had to be replaced, and it was painfully deafening. But tall, quiet Diana moved from loom to loom like the silent angel in the lion's den, keeping Daniel from harm. There were moments when all three looms were running as they ought, all the shuttles bearing full quills, all three temples hung high on the cloth, no warp thread snapping. During one of these respites, Diana drew Lyddie to the nearest window. The sill was alive with flowers blooming in pots, and around the frame someone had pasted single pages of books and magazines. Diana pressed down a curling corner of a poem. Most of the sheets were yellowing. Not so much time to read these days, Diana said. We used to have more time. Do you like to read, Lyddie? Lyddie thought of the regulations that she was still trying laboriously to decipher when no one was looking. I've not much schooling. Well, you can remedy that, the older girl said. I'll help, if you like, some evening. Lyddie looked up gratefully. She felt no need with Diana to apologize or to be ashamed of her ignorance. I'm needing a bit of help with the regulations. I shouldn't wonder. They're a trial for us all, Diana said. Why don't you bring the broadside over to number 3 tonight, and we'll slog through that wretched thing together. Amelia was not pleased that evening after supper when she realized that Lyddie was getting ready to go out. Your first day, you ought to rest. I'm all right, said Lyddie, and indeed, once the noise of the weaving room was out of her ears, she did feel quite all right, a bit tired, but certainly not over-weary. I aim to do a bit of studying, she said. It made her feel proud to say such a thing. Studying? With whom? The girl I'm working with in the weaving room, Diana. She realized that she didn't know Diana's surname. Amelia, Prudence, and Betsy worked in the spinning room on the 3rd floor, so she supposed they did not know Diana. Betsy looked up from her ever-present novel. Diana Goss? She asked. I don't know, just Diana. She was very kind to me today. Diana Goss? Echoed Amelia. Oh, Lyddie, don't be taken in. Lyddie couldn't believe her ears. Eh? If it's Diana Goss, Prudence said, she's a known radical, and Amelia is concerned. Eh? Betsy laughed. I don't think our little country cousin is acquainted with any radicals, known or unknown. I know Quakers, Lyddie said. Creation, they're abolitionists, every one, eh? Hurrah for you, Betsy put down her novel and made a little show of clapping her hands. Amelia was sewing new ribbons on her Sunday bonnet and watching Betsy's performance, managed to jab the needle into her finger instead of the hat brim. She stuck her finger in her mouth and looked up annoyed. I wish you wouldn't keep saying things like creation and Lyddie. It's so... Only the new girls from Vermont speak like that, said Prudence, whose own mountain speech was well tamed. Lyddie didn't quite know what to do. She had no desire to anger her roommates, but she was quite set on going to see Diana. It wasn't just the foolish regulations. She wanted to learn everything, to become as quietly competent as the tall girl. She knew enough about factory life already to realize that good workers in the weaving room made good money. It wasn't like being a maid where hard work only earned you a bonus in exhaustion. "Well," she said, tying her bonnet, "I'll be back soon." "I'd rather you wouldn't go at all," Amelia said coolly. Lyddie smiled. She didn't mean to seem unfriendly or even ungrateful, though it was tiresome to be always beholden to Amelia. "I don't want you to worry after me. I'm able to do for myself, eh?" "Ha!" Betsy's short laugh came out like a snort. "It's just," Prudence said, "it's just that you haven't been here long enough to know about certain things. Amelia doesn't, well, none of us want you to find yourself in an awkward situation." For a moment Lyddie was afraid that Amelia or even Prudence would start in to lecture her, so she grabbed her shawl and said as she was moving out of the bedroom door, "I'll watch out," though what she was promising to look out for she had no idea. Diana's boarding house was only 2 houses away from her own. The architecture was identical, a 4-story brick building lined with rows of windows that blinked like sleepy eyes as lamps and candles were lit against the dusk of an April evening. The front door was unlocked, so she walked into the large front room like Miss Bedloe's, nearly filled with 2 large dining tables, but with the semblance of a living area on one side. And just as in Miss Bedloe's parlor, chairs had been pulled away from the tables and girls were chatting and sewing and reading in the living area. It was as noisy and busy as a chicken yard. Peddlers had come off the street to tempt the girls with ribbons and cheap jewelry. A local phrenologist was in one corner measuring a girl's skull and preparing to read her character from his findings. Several girls were watching this consultation transfixed. Lyddie pushed the door shut but stood just inside, uncertain how to proceed. How could she ask for Diana when she wasn't even sure of her proper name? But she needn't have worried. Out of the chattering mass of bodies, Diana rose from her chair in the corner and came to where Lyddie stood. She smiled, and her long, serious face creased into dimples. "I'm so glad you came. Let's go upstairs where we can speak in something less than a shout." What a relief it was to climb the stairs and leave most of the racket 2 floors behind. There was no one else in Diana's room. "What a treat," Diana said, as though reading Lyddie's mind. "Sometimes I'd sell my soul for a moment of quiet, wouldn't you?" Lyddie nodded. She suddenly felt shy around Diana, who seemed even more imposing away from the looms when her lovely, elegant voice was pitched rich and low like the call of a mourning dove. "First, we need to get properly introduced," she said. "I'm Diana Goss." She must have noted a flicker of something in Lyddie's face because she added, "The infamous Diana Goss," and dimpled into her lovely smile. Lyddie reddened. "So you've been warned." "Not really." "Well, then, you will be. I'm a friend of Sarah Bagley's." She watched Lyddie's face for a reaction to the name, and when she got none, tried another. "Amelia Sargent? Mary Emerson? Huldah Stone? No? Well, you'll hear those names soon enough. Our crime has been to speak out for better working conditions." She looked at Lyddie again. "Yes, why, then, should the operatives themselves fear us? It is, dear Lyddie, the nature of slavery to make the slave fear freedom." "I'm not a slave," Lyddie said, more fiercely than she intended. "You're not here for a lecture. I'm sorry. Tell me about yourself." It was hard for Lyddie to talk about herself. She'd had no practice. With Amelia and Prudence and Betsy she didn't need to. They, especially Amelia, seemed always to be telling her about herself or trying to make her like themselves. Besides, what was interesting about her? What would someone like Diana want to know? "There's Charlie," she began, and before she knew it she was explaining that she was here to earn the money to pay off her father's debts, so she and Charlie could go home. Diana did not smile ironically or laugh as Betsy was sure to. She did not once lecture her as though she were a slow child, the way Amelia often did, or offer a single explanation as Prudence would have felt obliged to. No, the tall girl perched on the edge of a bed and listened silently and intently until Lyddie ran out of story to tell. Lyddie was a bit breathless, never having said so many words in the space of so few minutes in her life, and then, embarrassed to have talked so long about herself, she asked, "But I reckon you know how it is with families, eh?" "Not really. I can hardly remember mine. Only my aunt that kept me until I was 10. And she's gone now." Lyddie made as if to sympathize, but Diana shook it off. "I think of the mill as my family. It gives me plenty of sisters to worry about. But," she said, "I don't think I need to worry about you. You don't know what it is not to work hard, do you?" "I don't mind work. The noise." Diana laughed. "Yes, the noise is terrible at the beginning, but you get accustomed to it somehow." Lyddie found that hard to believe, but if Diana said so. "And I don't suppose you think of a 13-hour day overly long, either." Lyddie's days had never been run on clocks. "I just work until the work is done," she said, "but I never had to leave to go paying calls in the evenings before." "And the wages seem fair?" "I ain't been paid yet, but from what I hear—" "What did you get at the end?" "I don't know, 50 cents the week, I think. They sent it to Mama. Tryphena said the mistress was likely to forget as not." "I suppose Charlie—" Lyddie stopped speaking. Neither Charlie nor her mother knew where she was. "Is something the matter, Lyddie?" I haven't wrote them, Charlie nor my mother. They don't know where I am. Suppose they needed her. How would they find her? Lyddie felt the panic rising. She was cut off from them all. She might as well have gone to the other side of the world. She was out of their reach. When will they pay me? If it's paper you need. It's postage, too. I'd have to prepay. They don't have the money to pay at the end. I could manage postage. I can't borrow. I borrowed too much already. But Diana quietly insisted. Lyddie owed it to her family to let them know right away, she said. She brought out paper, pen, and ink, and a sturdy board for Lyddie to write upon. Lyddie would have felt shy about forming her letters so laboriously in front of Diana, but Diana took up a book and made Lyddie feel as though she were alone. Dear Mother, you will be surprised to know I am gone to Lowell to work. I am in the weaving room at the Concord Corp. I board at number 5 if you write me. Everyone is kind and the food is plenty and tasty. I am saving my money to pay the debts. I am well. I trust you and the babies are well too. Your faithful daughter, Lydia Worthen. It seemed extravagant to take another sheet to write to Charlie, but Diana had said that she ought to write to him as well. Dear brother, do not be surprised. I am gone to Lowell for a factory girl. Everyone is kind, the work is all right, but machines is noisy. Believe me, the money is good. I will save and pay off the debts so we can still hop. Ha ha. Your loving sister, Lydia Worthen. P.S. I am at Concord Corp. number 5 if you can write. Excuse all mistakes. I am in great hurry. She folded the letters, sealed them with Diana's wax, and addressed them. Before she could ask further about posting them, Diana took the letters from her hand. I have to go tomorrow anyhow. Let me mail them for you. I'll pay you back as soon as I get paid, she sighed. As soon as I pay Tryphena. No, said Diana. This time it's my welcoming gift. You mustn't try to repay a gift. The bell rang for curfew. We haven't looked at the silly regulations, Diana said. Well, another time. Diana walked her to number 5. It was a bright, cool night, though in the city the stars seemed dim and far away. Until tomorrow, Diana said at the door. I'm obliged to you for everything, Lyddie said. Diana shook her head. They need to know. They'll worry. The roommates were already getting into bed. You're late, Amelia said. I come as soon as the bell rung. Oh, you're not really late, said Betsy. Amelia just doesn't approve of where you've been. It was Diana Goss, wasn't it? Amelia asked. Yes. And? Lyddie was taking off her bonnet, then her shawl. And what? What did Amelia mean? Amelia answered her own question. Did she try to make you join? Lyddie folded her shawl, still uncomprehending. She means, said Betsy, did she tie you up and torture you until you promised to join the Female Labor Reform Association? Oh, Betsy, said Prudence. She never mentioned such, Lyddie said. She made her way around Amelia and Prudence's bed and trunks to the side of the bed that she shared with Betsy. She sat on the edge and began to take off her shoes and stockings. Then what were you doing all that time? Betsy slammed her book shut. What affair is it of yours, Amelia? It's all right, Lyddie said. She had no desire to get her roommates stirred up over nothing. She just give me paper to write to my family to tell them where I was. Oh, Lyddie, Prudence said, how thoughtless of us. We never offered. No matter, Lyddie said. I've done it now. She's devious, Amelia muttered. You have to watch her. Believe me, Lyddie, I'm only thinking of your own good. Betsy snorted, reached over, and blew out the candle as the final curfew bell began to clang.